Wow. Well, I guess we're gonna end. Well, we're not gonna end the stream in the spirit of everybody else being in lockdown. I'm just gonna change the position here for the camera. In the spirit of the season, I guess I'm also going to do my live stream from home. Uh, it seems everybody's doing something like this. They said work from home, so we're gonna work from home. We're going to have this series begin tonight. We're going to discuss Haggadat Hapesah until Pesach. Of course, Thursday nights we're going to dedicate to the parasha. This will be a very important parasha, Vayakil Pekudei. We have in practice the construction of the tabernacle. The Rambam and others count the building of the temple as a positive commandment. Half of the book of the Torah, half of the book of Exodus, Shemoth, is dedicated to this particular commandment and its sub-commandments. Building the temple is a commandment, and the fact that so much detail is given to the commandment in theory and then in practice just shows you how important, how critical the commandment is, and perhaps is a lesson for us that perhaps we should also dedicate ourselves to keeping this commandment. We're talking tonight about Haggadah Pesach, the esoterical introduction to the Haggadah. We'll talk about some other time. First, we have to talk about the technical aspects. First, there is your Seder plate. Your Seder plate, as of now, is basically the way, for example, Rambam and describes it based on the Gemara, and this seems to be the practical way. The Seder plate was the plate that is brought to the individual who was lying on a special eating couch. It was basically a padded bench. It wasn't a couch like we have, and it wasn't a bed like we have, even though it's called a bed in Chazal's terms. They used to sit and relax when eating, and they would bring the meal was brought to them on a tray. So your Seder plate is really supposed to be the various foods you will eat over the course of that meal. So your Seder plate is supposed to have what's going to consist of your meal. And there's two portions there. One, traditionally, I guess, is the zroa, a shank bone. I've never seen that on a Seder plate. I grew up in the hotel culture. And it's always a piece of a chicken wing, just a little bone with a little meat on it. One time I even saw a drumstick and a roasted egg. And the maror and the haroseth, etc. Really, those are supposed to be the things that we're going to eat. And most people don't actually eat right off the Seder plate, especially because nowadays the Seder plates, you just get a little token amount. And even though it seems that indeed you're only supposed to eat just token amounts of let's say, the maror, which we'll use lettuce or horseradish for that, even though horseradish is not exactly, people still use it. There's a place for it on the Seder plate. Being that most people eat a lot more lettuce, and some people even feel that, even though, it's been pointed out by Rabbi Slifkin and others, when Chazal said you only need an olive size amount, it meant it's a very easy commandment to fulfill. You just need a little piece. It's now become a challenge. By the way, the Seder plates that we have today are very symbolic, and a person can't have his whole meal on that plate. But really, that's what it's meant to be. The Seder plate was supposed to have the food that he's going to eat over the course of Seder. His matzahs are also on the side. He's going to be eating that matzah and the food for the rest of the meal. That's the way it was supposed to be. And indeed, this is part of the reason. This is the practice as it was at every meal, including the Shabbat and Yom Tov meals. What they would do was they would first recite Kiddush over a cup of wine, and then they would wash their hands, and the food would be brought to them, and including the bread. So then they would, they would recite the blessing, hamotzi, on the bread, and begin their meal and eat whatever they're eating with their bread. This led to an interesting sociological change, a cultural change also. People started sitting at tables like we have, European style, chairs and tables. And food was already on the table, and everybody had individual plates. So people would start putting the bread on the table. So the Tosafists, they record this cultural change So because you're supposed to have the blessing on the wine and the kiddush precede the blessing on the bread, which normally be first, so now you have to cover the bread. But indeed, the custom of the Vilna Gaon, based on the classical practice, is to children, is to uh, basically only bring the bread to the table after the kiddush is recited, just like they used to do. So you're supposed to have a tray or a plate with the foods you're going to eat. And now that we have the Korban Pesach on the table, it's a little bit different. What you need is, yes, you need your matzot. By the way, classically they only use 2 matzot. You would find this in Art Scrolls mentioned this. A lot of the Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva and scholars were aware of this classical approach, so they did not have a third matzah. They had 2 matzahs. They have their maror, and they don't have maror and hazareth. They just have the maror they're going to use. They have haroseth for dipping, and they have the karpas, the vegetable they're going to eat at the beginning of the seder, and they have the korban pesach food, the meat of the korban pesach, and that comes on its own tray. And if there's a chagiga, that is the additional celebration sacrifice that is offered, so that there's more food at the meal. So that is also on the tray. The chagiga, even when the korban pesach is brought, the chagiga is not necessarily brought. When we get to that section, we'll see under what circumstances is there also a chagiga. It's an optional part of the seder. So this is the seder plate as is, and that's why I'm going to mention it. I have a thing here. Where is it? Which page is it? I can't find it now. Okay. So it's there, and we're going to see this here. Oh, yeah, it's on the first page. We make the seder plate with maror, karpas, charoseth. Okay, people are familiar with those 3. You have to eat them, and then it says gufo shel korban pesach uvsar chagiga im hikrivu oto ushtei matzot shlot. Okay. There you have it. That's basically how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to have the korban pesach also, and the chagiga, and 2 whole matzahs. We begin with kadesh. That is the normal thing. That's how it begins. The kadesh is untouched. This is the kadesh. One recite. Kadesh is equivalent to the kiddush. It's recited on every night that is a Sabbath or Yom Tov, and also even if chas v'shalom, a person ends up in the most unfortunate circumstance where he has nothing to eat at his seder, that would be a mitzvah. Let's say he has some, apples. He only has his fruits and rice to eat at his seder. And there's been emergency situations, and he has a cup of wine. So he would still recite the kiddush. He has no seder plate. The apples he cannot use for his karpas. They're not a vegetable. And the rice is going to be his meal. They're just replacing his matzah, so there's nothing they could do. So he would not have a seder plate, but even so, he still needs to recite kiddush. This is the first cup, and like I said, it's untouched, and that's how you would find it. Then we get to urchatz. This is a very interesting one that was pointed out by Rabbi Weber. I'll read it here. Mikivan shochlim b'layla zeh korban pesach, because now we're going to, tonight, we're eating the Korban Pesach. Afilu achilat chulin tzricha liot al Torah HaKodesh v'natzilach v'natilach ova. The consumption of the non-sacrificial food. What's the non-sacrificial food? Well, the actual meat of the korban, or the korbanoth, the sacrifices, those are sacrificial food. But let's say even the matzah, or whatever else you were eating at your meal, the karpas, the maror, that's not sacrificial. Those still have to be eaten b'tarat hakodesh. That means with level of sanctity or level of purity that would be given to sacrificial foods, and therefore a person has to wash his hands. And therefore, as a person is intending to eat a kazait or more of the karpas, that's the vegetable with which he starts a seder. The karpas is traditionally, they say in Arabic, it still means celery, but you could use other vegetables. They have to wash their hands in birkat al natilat yadayim. They have to recite the blessing on this. Those who are not eating kazayis, do not recite the blessing, as you're familiar with the classical minhag. So this means that because it's an obligation, it'd be interesting. There's some people who say specifically don't eat a kazayith of karpas, and others say no, because if an act of eating, the sages required an act of eating here, so you should eat a kazayith. I've pointed out, you should just know, considering what Rabbi Slifkin has pointed out, Rav Lior has also pointed out, it's most of us do eat a kazayith. You'd have to eat. Remember, take an olive and look at your celery. Only if you're eating less than that would you not have to wash your hands. But usually we eat a little bit more celery than that. I remember personally, my father practiced that he got from his grandfather to eat scallions or some other form of onion. The problem with, let's say, eating certain forms of onion is that for many, that's not a vegetable. That's just something that's eaten on its own. They would say the blessing on an onion is a shakol, because no one just takes onion and eats it straight up like they would, let's say, carrots or potatoes, or in this case, celery. However, I do know, since quite a few years now, I've grown my own scallions, just wild scallions, and they're actually quite good. I even have a dish that I make for the Shabbos Chol Hamoed, or for the last night of Passover, whatever it may be. Take the leftover lettuce and the celery and the scallions and make a matzah moror salad. A karpas moror salad. And it tastes quite good. You make some sort of, you cook it with some lamb, and it tastes like it's supposed to taste at the Seder. God willing, this year we'll also have that. We'll have it the night of the Seder. We'll be able to eat all these together. And also my father-in-law's family, they are also, apparently, they eat onions straight up. So for them, onions are kosher karpas, because the blessing on them would be ha'adamah. And then we get to the Haggadat Pesach. That's the part where Rambam says that you bring in the Seder plate, which has the Korban Pesach on it, because until now you haven't brought it in. Okay? This is we're doing it the classic way. You don't set the table. First you say Kiddush, and then you wash your hands, and now we bring in the food. So it says in Yadav Tmeot, Yesh Tovlam B'Mikveh Urechal Tfilat Yadayim Kedin Kodashim Ifnei Shemiviyat Pesach Eitzolam Subim. Because now they're actually touching the Korban Pesach, one should dunk his hands in the mikvah. Okay? That's the din kodshim, the sacrificial meat. It has to be brought in. Person has to find al tevilat yadayim. That's also sometimes, some say, is a perfectly cromulent substitution for washing one's hands. Hamotzi, find the kosher mikvah and dunk one's hands in there. Ein lotzi msar pesach min hacheder. Can't take the Korban Pesach out of that room. Necessarily the room, maybe it's just the house. I'll explain, God willing, why I said the room. If a person took out the meat from that room, he has now disqualified it, and it's forbidden to eat it. It'll have to be burned after Yom Tov. Small introduction. Why did I say the room? There is a prohibition removing the Pesach from its place. And the Korban Pesach begins its journey from, let's say, the pasture, and it is brought to the temple, at which point it is slaughtered. Sometime along the way, it has to be officially declared to be the sacrificial animal. That's its sanctification. An animal is not properly sanctified, it cannot be offered as sacrifice. On the other hand, it's best not to dedicate the animal, sanctify it until the last minute, or at least before the last minute, because once it's sanctified, it cannot be removed. And if chas v'shalom, for whatever reason, they're not allowed to offer the sacrifice, then this goat or lamb, as it may be, will be permanently holy, and it would just be a waste of a lamb, because you couldn't do anything. You have to just put it out to pasture forever, or redeem it for another sacrifice. But that still, there's some animals going to waste, so it's not the wisest thing to do. And then a person could not use this animal; it would be a sin to use it for his own mundane purposes. So the Rambam defines the the sacrifice. Once it's sacrificial meat, it is brought out of the temple, where it is roasted, wherever it is they would do the roasting, and then perhaps prepared in some kitchen, eventually brought to those who are celebrating Passover at their Seder. And he says that the Passover has a defined place, its own mechitzot, just like with regards to the Sabbath domains. The private domain, Reshut HaYachid, is defined by the fact that it has walls all around it, or it's roofed. or a combination thereof, that's a private domain. And it's forbidden to take something from a private domain, a building, and bring it out to the public domain, wide open areas. And although nowadays let's say, our neighborhoods are defined as also extended form private domains because they're technically walled in, at least where I live, they are actually walled in. In cities, it's actually kind of a problem. What we call the eruv, the wire that goes between the poles all around the city, is not necessarily a private domain. There are those who would severely disagree. Um, they would still say it's public, but ever it may be, whatever defines a private domain, that's where the line ends. And then if a person would bring something out from the private domain to the public domain, he has violated the Sabbath. So too, he says, that's every Korban Pesach has its mechitzot, its defined walls around it, and the Pesach may not be moved out of there. So the fact is that it's not to the public domain; it's just out of this mechitzot. And with regards to the Sabbath, you have to cross that line between private domain to public domain. And if you have a number of private domains all connected to each other, rooms within a house or houses that are connected with no space in between them, so technically speaking, one could go between the private domain and private domain on the Sabbath without any problem. One private domain to another, with nothing intervening, is not considered leaving the private domain. But here he said it's particular mechitzot. And he's talking about houses within Jerusalem. Jerusalem, if it's perfectly walled in the olden days and up until recent history, was one private domain with regard to the Sabbath on a biblical level, because it's all surrounded by walls. So even if one leaves a building in Jerusalem, he's still within courtyards in Jerusalem, or he's still within walled Jerusalem. But that cannot be the exact standard with regards to the Pesach, because they're eating in different houses and different buildings or in different rooms within Jerusalem, and moving it from one house to another is already considered a prohibition. So it must be that, yes, each Korban Pesach has its defined mechitzot, its four walls, or three walls and a door, or its roof, whatever it is, it defines its location. It's to the exclusion of other private domains, and it doesn't have to be that a person removes the Korban Pesach to another private domain. This seems to be, by the way, the gist of the various Talmudic discussions in both the Bavi and Rishalmi. And therefore I wrote the room to play it safe, but one might have a good argument and say, within that building, the Korban Pesach cannot leave the building. But certainly, let's take the Rova, the currently existing Jewish quarter, has a nice open area where the Churva synagogue is. I would imagine that if someone were consuming his Korban Pesach in any of those restaurants around the courtyard or in the Yeshiva Kotel dormitory, he could not go out to the Rova, and that would disqualify the Korban Pesach. Thank you for joining this evening. We're going to pick up again tomorrow night, about an hour earlier, actually. Please like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next one, and send in your questions and comments. And thank you for supporting. If you would like to purchase a Haggadat Pesach, please contact me, and we'll arrange for it.